Well, Kim, thank you so much for coming on the In L&D podcast. Would you mind kicking us off by completing that sentence for me, please?
Yeah, sure, I will. So in L&D, there's a loud narrative right now that we're broken. But the critique could crowd out something really important, all of the brilliant work that's already happening.
Positivity. I like it. That's a good start to the conversation. And what I liked about this, you posted about on LinkedIn. A lot of these episodes start with, I see something great on LinkedIn. We should discuss this in more detail. And what I liked in your post is you had some good context around, you made the point it wasn't about putting on rose tinted glasses or pretending that everything's jolly, or ignoring the idea that L&D doesn't need to evolve. But you were saying that we should spend more time talking about what is working. So tell us about that kind of sentiment and the motivation behind the post.
Yeah, definitely. And that was it, right? I was having this week where I genuinely kept coming across really exciting work in the L&D field. Just really people doing brilliant things quietly. And then at the same time, I was scrolling my LinkedIn and I was seeing a lot of takes about L&D as an industry being in crisis. And look, I don't think that there's an L&D professional out there right now that wouldn't say, look, L&D does need to change and fast. Like a lot of industries, we're being hugely disrupted by AI. And I think there's a lot of things that we've been saying we need to change as an industry for a long time. And some of those things are still hanging around. So I get it. We do need to evolve. But I do think that there is a risk that we give ourselves, on top of a practice problem, a narrative problem as well. And if we do that, we're kind of just doing that to ourselves. And look, if everyone in the profession hears we're broken often enough, it really starts to affect how they see their own work. It affects how they pitch, how ambitious they're willing to be. And I think it can feel really overwhelming in that LinkedIn space at the moment. I think though, look, change happens when we see something that works. We've all felt that. You get a little spark of, you see something, you think, I could do that, And, that's how ideas travel. So shining a light, I think, on what's working, which is what the post was, about. It's not just about feeling good or ignoring the problems. I do think it's genuinely useful to spark new ideas and innovation. So the post was about starting that conversation. It was about creating that spark. I just thought, let's point at the good stuff for a minute. Let's ask people to share their wins, and they did. So that response told us that people do want to be in that conversation, which is great.
Yeah, exactly. The sentiment was loads of people agreeing with you. I've just done this thing. I've seen these people go through a program and it had this great outcome. I saw someone else do this case study and it gave me inspiration to do something different. And I love that framing about the narrative problem on top of the practice problem, because it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy of, I don't realize I'm doing good work because the noise is that everything is doom and gloom, and then I lose perspective of all the good things I'm doing because I feel like I'm behind or someone else is doing it this way. So I love that idea of just shifting the perspective and trying to work out what your own narrative is, not just what I'm hearing every day.
That's it. And I don't know, I mean, it's difficult, right? I don't see what other industries are talking about as much, but just as I'm out and about, I don't see or hear other industries being so self-critical, or certainly putting that out on a public platform. So it's just really interesting. What I'm not sure is it unique to L&D? It can't be, I'm sure. Maybe it just feels like it's really loud because I'm in it.
Yeah. Well, marketing, which I'm in, is the opposite. People are telling you all the time they're doing a great job. So I'm right at the other end of the spectrum. And also they need the same, probably the opposite treatment on themselves. Their narrative problem is that they're cherry picking all of the stuff that makes them look good or only shouting about their successes. So it's interesting. We're coming out from two other ends of the spectrum. Hopefully we'll end up in the middle at the end with a good practical viewpoint on it.
Find a balance. I love it.
In the post as well, you talking about that positivity, but with that bit of pragmatism around it's not all rose tinted. You had a lovely framing in the post. You said, over the last couple of weeks, I've observed brilliant people quietly shifting the needle through action, not by preaching what we should do, but by modeling what's already possible. And we touched on it a bit, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this. There's a million things we could do, but what are actually the things we should do that are going to make a difference to us and our organization and, the impact we can have?
Yeah, definitely. And look, I think, any profession, I'm sure, can get stuck in a loop of talking about what good looks like or, what's not working. And L&D, I'm sure, is as guilty as any. And I think as an industry, I mean, I've been working in L&D now for around 15 years. And I think, we've been talking about those shoulds, future of learning, it's not really shifted that much. Future of learning, personalised learning. Future of learning, measuring impact. Future of learning, learning in the flow of work. These are not new conversations, but at some point the future has to arrive. And sometimes I do wonder if it has arrived, but we're still looking for the next thing. And that's not that's an ambitious behaviour. I think, that's excellent. But I do think what's super exciting is when you see people getting on with the work, they prototype something, they test it, they share what happens. And I think that's how the profession moves forward. That's so powerful. I personally find that more powerful than hearing about the problems, but instead here's how people are trying to solve them. That's where we get those great ideas from. And I think, that is how we will move forward. But what's really important is I do think as an industry as well, we can be quite hard on ourselves. Everything that I had seen, in those examples, the positive things that week, nothing was the finished article. Nothing was there with a big bow around it, all done, complete. It was all in testing. It was being refined. It was failing fast. It was, kind of prioritizing progress over perfection. So I think that's really powerful as well. Those teams that I saw doing things in action, they weren't waiting until they had the perfect conditions or the perfect methodology. So I think that's what we need as a profession is more of that raw progress. So not case studies from 5 years ago that have got that nice neat bow on them, but work that's in motion, really honestly shared.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it links back to what you said about the narrative issue, because if you're constantly waiting for the next trend to be told to you, or this is what's going to be important, then you work towards something that's probably shifted by the time you get there. Whereas
Yeah.
if you're really pragmatic about the problem you're facing now, then you can say, well, let's test this over like a short period, as opposed to trying to keep up with something that feels like it's always changing, because that is what people say. I'm trying to keep up with whatever's changing in the industry, but actually is that kind of you're setting yourself up to fail by doing that, when really you could probably do like three things in your business that will have a massive impact, and no one's talking about those things in the public sphere maybe.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think there's something as well that maybe feels vulnerable when you
Yeah.
start sharing raw work and raw progress. And I think it can be challenging as well if you are then faced with lots of questions, what about this? Have you thought about that? But it's a mindset thing. I think sometimes it can feel like a vulnerable place to go is sharing your work early. But it does genuinely add value to others. So yeah, progress over perfection, I think, is a really important mantra for us at the moment.
Yeah. I guess, sometimes we spend ages on something, and then when it's done and it doesn't necessarily work out, there's like this big amount of feedback. But actually, if you just shared it periodically about honestly what's going on, then, this feedback you might be scared of, or the failure you might be scared of at the end, you can kind of mitigate the amount of it that happens. And actually the end result might be better because you've decided to share honestly and frequently, like, this week we're doing this. I know we're going to get into some of the ways that you've been doing this, but I think maybe the fear of the feedback you get at the end stops people sharing honestly throughout the journey. But actually the thing that would be most beneficial in terms of learning and feedback and testing would be to share often and honestly, like you said.
Yeah, and widely as well. I think, like, I would say of the some of the examples I shared in my post and that we're going to talk a little bit about today, I know a lot of the people who've been driving that work, and these are not necessarily individuals that are going to shout publicly about their work externally. They are passionate about quietly getting on with the job, driving that progress. And I think hopefully, if we can encourage people to share more widely, it's like we get a broader diversity of voices as well, and examples and things like that. So yeah, some of the work I'm going to talk about today and that I shared in my post, it's not my work. It's It's things that I've maybe been involved in on the periphery, but it's been done just by brilliant individuals who, they're walking the talk. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah. I was about to say I love a tangent and we'll get into the things you did in the post, but then another tangent came to me and I was just going to say, you mentioned people who are doing the work quietly and getting on with it. When you start maybe reflecting that what that person's doing internally or saying back to that person how good it is, I mean, are you seeing a change in maybe that feedback loop that we spoke about earlier where people don't realize they're doing good work, but if you start building this culture where you're going, actually, this thing you're doing is really cool, or we should share this more often, are you seeing kind of a direct shift in that narrative we were talking about right at the start?
I think we would if we continue to kind of focus on some of these positives, because I think sometimes it's almost like there's a level of kind of getting on with the job and a level of modesty, certainly in some of the examples that I've seen, where maybe even people aren't sitting thinking, wow, this thing that I'm doing is really brilliant, really amazing, because it's just what they're doing. It's like, this is what I do. But actually, when I look at it as somebody who's, on the periphery or outside of that work, I'm like, wow, this is great. Loads of people could learn from this. So, yeah, I think it could. I think the more that we can sprinkle these kind of really practical examples into some of the narrative that we've got in the industry, I think it'll spark a lot more kind of sharing and innovation, and ultimately it will help us move quicker individually and collectively.
Yeah. Awesome. Right, now I am on a tangent, Ben. We're going to get into the post and some of the great stuff you mentioned, positive things you'd seen just by observing other people. And I think the one that really encapsulates the sentiment the best is you talked about this shift to respecting what people already know by shifting the question from what do we teach to what is already known by using pre-assessments, and it helped increase speed to competence. So tell us about what that was, how it was received, and that impact on the speed to competence.
Yeah, for sure. So, look, there's a lot of kind of rhetoric out there and a lot of chat about how important it is that, when we are helping people develop their skills, that it's relevant, it's timely, it's personalised. There's a lot out there. I was at Learning Technologies a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of conversation about, the one-size-fits-all course. Like, does that have a place anymore? Where does it have a place? Because actually, in the direction we're moving, the capability that AI gives us is that actually we can personalise at scale, and that's super exciting. But what I had seen was actually it was simple, but it was in the context of mandatory learning. So moving away from the idea that mandatory learning has to mean that everyone spends the same amount of time on the same content. And the team that I had seen doing the work, they had asked themselves the question, mandatory learning is super critical, especially if you're in a regulated industry. They asked themselves, how do we keep our organisation, our customers and our colleagues safe and secure, but also respect what people already know? And using pre-assessments has been a hugely successful lever. So, first of all, I'm sure lots of other places will be tapping into this. It's something that I'm sure is quite widely utilised, but it's just such a simple way to assess retained knowledge, drive smarter learning, in our case across the mandatory curriculum, and reduce that training time for colleagues that are already able to demonstrate that capability. It means that they can skip content, they can fast forward through content, and the benefits are really strong because, yes, there's efficiency there. It's driven a substantial reduction in training hours. That comes with a commercial benefit in terms of resource, time and cost. But this is about experience as well. And I think what that team have created is the story's as much about relevance as it is efficiency. So I think for me, the real story was that by respecting that prior knowledge, it's good for colleague experience, it's good for productivity, it's great commercially, and when it's done well, it can strengthen the focus and effectiveness of mandatory learning rather than dilute it. So it felt like a really great example. We so often talk about what impact is the work that we're doing in L&D having, and there for me, I thought, seeing that work, what a commercial benefit, absolutely, a colleague experience benefit, and you can, of course, we can think about this like banging a pre-assessment on the front of some content, but this team, I know the work that has gone into working with their stakeholders to influence that and to make sure that the stakeholders comfortable with the experience, and that we have assessed all of the risk elements, and the fact that they have been tenacious in following that through and are now managing to scale this, then that impact is really great. So that was one that's really stood out to me recently.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone made that point before, that mandatory doesn't mean everyone spends the same amount of time on a piece of content, because I think often, like you said, where it is something that's maybe regulated or has to be done, people think, well, to cover ourselves, it has to be from here to here. But it doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that someone might know all of this part and all of this part, and then we're asking them to just go through everything because that's the easiest way for us to distribute it to them. And then we often hear the narrative of internal brand, or why don't people have time for learning? All of these things are, downstream of just sending everyone the same blanket thing. So just to kind of clarify, so it was a qualifying question around how much knowledge people already had around this subject, and then maybe tailoring what the offering was to that person based on what they already knew.
Exactly. It's about testing that knowledge up front and then adapting the pathway based on the knowledge that they're already able to demonstrate. So I think that in the kind of context of mandatory it's really important that we can evidence that, that capability. That's really important. That's why the kind of content is there in the first place. But I think what the team have achieved is a way of kind of meeting that requirement, but also putting colleague at the heart of the experience.
Yeah. And what was kind of the reception for that internally? Were people really thrilled that, oh, actually, this is coming to me now and it feels really relevant? And as a business, we can see collectively across our teams that everyone's getting a unique experience and people aren't spending more time than is needed on that. Do you have any, is there anything you can share around that?
I think in terms of reaction, so I would say probably in the earlier days when we were starting to put the pre-assessments in and people were feeling that immediate benefit of it releasing that time for them, yeah, absolutely, really, really positive response. I would say we're at a place where it's become normal and expected. So actually, that's no bad thing as well. It's become part of our business as usual. But I think it's that kind of, it absolutely, we saw in that initial reaction. I think where then we see the positive reaction from a stakeholder perspective, more of a kind of business leader perspective, is, everyone's got a different angle at this. The pounds and the pence and the resource savings, this is time that can be reinvested into customers, into really kind of high value activity. So that really does, land with our business stakeholders as a story, which is great.
Yeah, that's great. Like I said, everyone essentially benefits from that. The L&D team is doing great work. The person at the end of the learning experience, it feels relevant to them. The people maybe at the top of the management level, they can see the benefit to everyone else. So it goes to show you that testament around reflecting on the thing that is useful to you, not necessarily the narrative, can have a really contextual impact on your business. And that's the perfect segue into the next piece from your post. You'd mentioned that you'd seen peer learning influencing business KPIs, and that this was around an experience for frontline colleagues. So tell us a bit more about, what that was and also how it worked and what you learned from that.
Yeah, no problem. So first off, there are so many things that I love about this example. So if I start by talking a little bit about what we were, trying to do. So essentially developing, a journey, a skill development journey, but delivered through community learning. So it wasn't about creating the thing, the content, the thing that you can look at or touch and feel, but instead it was about driving straight through community learning, supplemented with tools, insights, and effective prompts. So this was the kind of experience that the team have developed. And essentially that experience was being developed for, in this case, branch managers, who we could see that need to support branch managers in thinking like a customer and acting like an entrepreneur. And the team had a real crystal clear view on how that would show up in business outcomes and commercial metrics over time. So whether that's business activity, referrals, customer satisfaction. Okay. And I think that, first of all, it's one of those, you've got a really clear problem, right? Starting from a really good place. So that's great. But what I did really love was the design intent. The fact that the team that were working on this, it wasn't about, sort of shipping a digital module. It was about really thinking about practical transfer first rather than information transfer. So practical application over information transfer. So it not being about content. Again, if I think about how much we are hearing out in the kind of industry world about, AI is kind of sending us into a place where content is becoming a commodity. And actually that means that, as L&D functions, we have to think about, where do we add unique value, in the future? And I think sometimes we have defaulted to kind of mass content creation because it's scalable. And I was actually listening to one of your podcasts from a few weeks ago, and there was someone who appeared on your podcast who talked about sometimes something needs to feel visible to feel valuable, and that being almost a little bit of a cultural thing that can exist. And I agree. And I think in this case, the team pushed through that, focused on the practical transfer, and really designed something about creating an environment for sharing and learning from each other with the right prompts and tools, of course, to support it. So that was a big tick. There was really clear intent, as I say, about the problem and the metrics that it was going to move. And I think what I saw when I heard about that work was that the real value hasn't been in content consumption. It's been about seeing what happens when people connect and share what works and build confidence through practical commercial conversations. And they can see the original intent showing up in the business metrics off the back of that. It's almost, what I can see from this example is it's people who've spent as much time thinking about the before and after of training as the actual training. And I think that's just been really superb. They also moved really fast. So back to our earlier point, they started small, they tested, they piloted through a series of sprints. And now they're in this brilliant position of being able to evidence the value and the benefits and understanding what this needs to look like at scale, because they've seen it in practice. So, I think there was a few things that were great about it, but for me, contentless course with business impact. And I just thought the amount of kind of chat we hear about that, and I loved seeing a little micro example of it in action.
Do you know what? One thing I love about having these conversations is to see how it works in different industries, because different industries, sometimes a specific industry is really good at shining a light on how something can be done. So you mentioned the outcome is, customer referrals, customer happiness, customer retention. If you want to know actually how to engage with customers, the only person who can really help you with that is the branch managers that you mentioned, who interact with customers every single day. So if you did rush to create content, you wouldn't really know the problem as intimately as someone like the branch manager. And then it makes complete sense that you would go, well, the best way to get this at scale is to bring all of the branch managers maybe together to learn as a community. And then you're clear on what the problem is, you're clear on the person who knows it best, and you're clear on the way to bring those people together to share it. And then, like you say, if that validates it at a small level, of course you can scale it. And I think that's testament to not just rushing to the output and taking time to go, actually, if I want to influence the business KPI, what is the KPI? What are the problems that prevent the KPI being realized? And who are the people who know best how to solve the problem that stops the KPI being kind of hit in the end?
That's it. You're spot on. There's that kind of element about, we talked earlier about respecting what people already know. And there's an element, I hadn't really thought about it until now, but there's an element of that in this example, because it's about, a team within an L&D function who are recognizing that the people who know most need to just be in the room and be given the space and the tools and maybe the framework to work through the problem, rather than being hit with a bunch of information about how we could do things differently. So, it's back to respecting what people know, actually.
There you go. That's a core fundamental throughout this conversation now, is respecting what people know. And you talked about maybe future-proofing L&D and what can unlock L&D earlier in the conversation. It's that kind of mindset, isn't it? Am I, being honest to myself, the best person to create whatever is needed to make this happen? Or am I better off just facilitating and getting the right people together and given a platform and the skill set and, like you said, the tools, the prompts, the frameworks to make sure that knowledge from that person gets to other people and respect what they know?
Yeah.
Let's do one final example, because you'd also mentioned in your post something similar, which was shifting the dial when it came to measurement. And this was about tracking changes in colleague behavior and KPIs before and after training, which I think is something I see a lot of frustration with, because people don't necessarily know how to do it. They get to the end of something, they don't know what's changed. They're not really happy with just using feedback scores. And then you hear the word happy sheets used a lot. So tell me about what was happening here, the approach to shifting the dial on measurement, and kind of what you learned from that as well.
Yeah, no problem. And look, I think measurement for L&D is one of those things that a lot of L&D professionals would say, I think it's the thing that keeps them up at night. And I know myself, I've been involved in lots of work over the years where we've measured what's easy rather than measuring what matters, like 100%. And I'm going to start by being fair to the humble happy sheet, right? Because the happy sheet does get a really, really hard time. But I think, look, if you want to know how something landed, particularly if you're piloting an experience, then a post-event survey is a perfectly reasonable tool for that. It tells you something real and it tells you something useful. So I think sometimes we bash the happy sheet, but the real problem is when the happy sheet becomes your entire measurement strategy. That's where the real kind of problem is. In my world, my team, we use something that we call a measurement map. So it's essentially a bit of a structured way for us to build plans that get us clear on what needs to be measured and why, at what point, all linking back to the kind of business objective or the problem. Now, engagement and experience are a really important part of the story. So I think sometimes we can scoff at kind of completions and, oh, it's just activity. And it is, but it's a really valuable part of the story as well. It tells us something. But what we do is we build on top of that. We think about it in terms of, okay, we've got activity, engagement, but then we move on to then thinking about what metrics are going to help us to demonstrate learning gain, i.e. that behavioural shift. And what metrics are we going to be able to track downstream that show us that there is a knock-on kind of business impact? So we use this measurement map that just helps us to organise our thinking. So critically though, for that approach to work for us, there has to be that really clear business problem to solve in the first place. But the work that I talked about in my post was really about optimising how we evidence that learning gain element at scale and more consistently, and business impact too. So we're in the experiment stage at the moment. So inspired, again, great ideas travel, inspired by some external best practice, and we're trialling a method of measuring behavioural shifts using scenario-based surveys, pre and post learning. Now that concept, pre and post learning, it's as old as L&D time for sure. It's not new, but what we are doing is we are capturing the outputs in a way that can be connected to business metrics over time. So that's been exciting. We've been, as part of that, we've been experimenting with AI tools for question generation, for helping us to connect results back to a single data model. So it has felt like steps forward. We're not there yet, but it's been progress over perfection. Yeah. And I think this is probably that really good example of where we don't have to have a perfect case study tied up in a bow, but we're learning with others. We're starting small with the aim of creating something that gives us much richer impact insights at scale. So I think something that, absolutely, as we learn more as we go along, I will make sure that I'm sharing more of that through LinkedIn with others as well.
You know what I love about that whole mindset, starting with the happy sheets in moderation. You know, they can't just be your whole strategy. Is goes back to that point at the start. The narrative is either this thing is good or bad, but actually the real narrative is this thing can be an indication of this. But like you
Yeah,
said, let's build upon that. And I love
yeah,
that idea of the measurement map. Are you kind of doing that on a per project or per problem basis, saying these are the different components? This is what would indicate engagement. This would indicate behavior change. This is the outcome that would indicate it's actually been effective.
yeah. It gives us almost gives us a framework to work through ourselves in terms of testing our own thinking on a project by project basis, but also with stakeholders as well. It allows us to really make sure that we're partnering with the business to understand, right, what data can we capture from an L&D perspective, what data will we bring in from a business perspective, how will that all come in, together to create a really powerful story. So it definitely gives us a way to organise our thinking, plan, and we do it on a project basis. We don't do it for everything.
Yeah.
We definitely, I'm sure lots of people think in exactly the same way, which is we put that energy where there is the most investment.
Yeah. Yeah. If you see a really significant business problem, then it's worth your time taking those extra measures to measure, build the measurement map. And data is a great point you mentioned there. Often people miss that. Who has access to data? Can I access the data that evidences it? Because sometimes you start planning something, you realize you're not the owner of the data, and then measurement becomes even harder. But if you bake that into the start with the measurement map of, well, this is the data we need, these are the stakeholders we need to work with to get it, I think it's just a more foolproof way to, then you can test at scale and move quickly because you have all the components in place, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And the last question, follow-up question, I told you I liked a tangent, but scenario-based learning is something I've not really come across, but I'm imagining that is asking someone, how would you solve X problem, or how would you act in X situation, training, and then measuring the kind of response against what they said before and seeing the progression in that.
Exactly that. So it's something that certainly others may be using it already. It's something I've not used before. I think we've used much more kind of direct questions around getting people to self-assess their capability. This felt like a smarter way of doing it, and it can still be connected to a kind of tangible data model in the background. So we are really excited to see what that can produce. I think what's interesting is, I know myself already, like with that approach, I've been guilty of the question of, oh, it's self-reported though, so is it viable data? What else do we need to do to make sure that that's really robust? And those are not the wrong questions, but I think it's the perfect example of sometimes where we can maybe let the desire for perfection to get in the way of the progress. And actually, I was reading something the other day, a study around kind of self-reported behaviours that actually, I know sometimes there's quite a strong emphasis on, those needing to be validated by managers or, being more objective, but actually something like a 92% accuracy rate in terms of how people rate their own knowledge.
Yeah.
I wish I had the quote because I could say where that's come from.
Yeah.
Maybe we can find a way
We'll
to put it in the
credit
notes.
we'll put it in the notes. Yeah.
But and I think that's a really good example where sometimes I think we can get caught up in the finer detail and lose the big picture benefit.
Yeah. That is a great example because, like you said, I went through the whole thought process there. I was like, oh yeah, that's great, scenario-based learning. And then you said, well, actually, is it self-reported? And they go, oh, actually, well, maybe you're right. And then you said, well, the data shows that self-reporting. But it made me think that I could have sat there, if I was in that position, question everything and then do nothing. But what I could say is the self-reporting, there might be a degree of discrepancy or fluctuation in the accuracy of it, but is there a better indication? And if there isn't, then you can decry it all you want, or you could just say, this is the best thing for me to use now, and I'll use it. And if I'm doing it smart in sprints or small scale, I can test it over a couple of weeks, and then I might learn that I've not sent the self-reported scenario-based learning to 1,000 people and then learned that measuring that's really hard. I've tested it with 20 and go, that can work if we do this and this to it.
Exactly. And I think if then we can validate that, like if we bring those business KPIs, then we can connect that together. It's more validation that potentially comes later. But see if that little study is right, the 92%. If it's right 92% of the time, then I think there's also that, right, when's good enough?
Yeah.
Like that's good enough.
well, I'm not right 92% of the time on anything. So I'll happily default to something that is, I'm probably on a 60% metric at the moment. So I'm more than happy to deflect to something with a bit more robustness. Amazing. Cool. Like I want to wrap it up by coming back to, collectively the examples. We talked about narrative at the start and how we can kind of shift it and gone through some great specifics. And I'd love to know if there's some common threads across these examples and that we've, shared, and also other stuff you've seen recently that you think could, like you said, unlock L&D and help it move forward and ignore this narrative that everything's broken and we are doing better work.
Yeah, I think look, when I reflect across all those examples that we've talked about today, I think the common thread that jumps out for me is partnership. So all of those examples, well, none of those examples, it's a better way of putting it, none of those examples happened in an L&D silo. So, if we take that kind of community peer learning program that I talked about, it was designed with the business around what the business needed. And there was a real kind of shared accountability on identifying the right metrics and tracking the progress to make sure that it was an effective, intervention. That impact was never going to show up in LMS data. So that partnership's absolutely critical. We've part of the team have been doing some experimentation with a learning agent to improve how colleagues search and discover for learning to build their skills. And, there's a really good example. I talked about that in the post as one of the successes that I'd seen, but that happened because L&D people and technologists got in a room together and worked it out and brought their different specialist knowledge together to create this idea. And I think that's the real unlock for our professional. It's that for our profession, it's that genuine partnership with the business to understand what success looks like and measure it honestly, with technology teams to build things that actually work in practice, and with learners themselves to actually understand what they already know and what they really need. So I think L&D is at its most powerful, not as a function that delivers learning to a business, but it's a function that thinks and builds alongside the business. And that's why these examples really excited me, because I think they're all quietly proving that, which I love.
Awesome. What a brilliant note to end on, Kim. What I'll do is I'll put that post in the description, and then if people want to connect with you, but even better if they want to go and read that post and follow your call to action on there to leave something that they've seen recently or a win they've had and help spread the positivity, then feel free to do that. But thank you for a great conversation, and really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gary.
Amazing. Brilliant.